August 14th, 1944, 2100 hours, Crystal City, Texas. Heat clung to the hospital siding like a hand that would not let go, and the searchlights paced the fence as if they too were on guard detail. Inside, the autoclave exhaled a steady hiss, and Nurse Mary Beth Keane snapped a sterile drape so it broke the air with a clean flag snap. The room smelled of carbolic, ether and creosote drifting from the fence posts, medicine, caution and war in one breath. Lucia Belandi gripped the rail, eyes shut against a contraction that rose quick and mean, then ebbed into a whisper of relief. She had expected the hard edges of contempt. Instead, a lieutenant with Iowa vowels apologized when the thermometer touched her tongue. He wore the U.S. Army Medical Corps caduceus on his collar and a habit of checking gauges the way a rifleman checks a chamber. "Steam pressure's in the green," Lieutenant Daniel Harrigan said, half to Mary Beth, half to the autoclave. The dial's needle trembled at a number he liked. He counted gauze rolls aloud. He lined forceps so their jaws nested, curved and gleaming. He had read the 1929 Geneva Convention, the way a mechanic reads torque specs. For him, the law was not sentiment, but procedure. Across the corridor, a clerk fed carbon paper into a Remington. Each keystroke thudded like a distant mortar. Belandi, Lucia. Alien internment camp, Crystal City, Zavala County, Texas. Not a sentence, not a brand. A location and a promise of record. Outside, private first class. Joe Alvarez walked the catwalk with the lazy confidence of a man who trusted his checklists. He could clear, load and shoulder the M1 Garand blindfolded. The .30 caliber M1919 on the tower pintle sat oiled and patient. Over his shoulder, the panhandle sky was a scuffed pot lid of heat haze. He watched the hospital windows. One flickered as the generator coughed, then steadied. He logged the moment in his little book. Fuel on hand, hours on the set, time to the next preventive maintenance checks and services. His job was to keep troubles small enough that the people inside never knew there had been any. Lucia knew about scarcity. She carried the weight of it in her shoulders and the rationed years in her hands. Seagoville had been clean, polite, confusing. Crystal City was stranger, fences and towers, yes, but also crisp sheets and a nurse who called her Mom in a voice that would not bend to meanness. The contraction returned, and with it a stab of fear that this place would turn on her, that kindness would snap shut like a trap. Mary Beth slid a hand into Lucia's, thumb tracing circles. "You're doing fine," she said. A Texan who could make reassurance sound like an order. Harrigan ran down the ether apparatus. Drip, mask, timing. He checked the fetal heart tones with a pinard horn, cheek pressed to wood as if listening to a seashell. The beat came back strong, regular, like a cadence march far away. He thought about trains, the GMC CCKW trucks that brought milk, citrus, gauze, the rail line that had no quarrel with what it carried, bullets or oranges. He thought about how often victory arrived disguised as a crate of something ordinary. Alvarez paused at post 3. The fence hummed desert heat. Crickets worked their own kind of Morse. A freight horn spread across the flats, lazy and powerful, as if reminding everyone that the continent itself was on schedule. He remembered his basic rifle marksmanship instructor barking about sight picture, breathing, trigger squeeze. He remembered his father telling him that a ledger balanced is a wall that does not fall. He flipped the page and tallied the ammunition remaining per tower. Enough. Always enough. That was the difference. Lucia's husband hovered with the awkwardness of a man who wanted to be useful and could not be. He kept offering to lift things. Harrigan had him sit, then put him in charge of counting her breathing. "In on 3, out on 5, the lieutenant said, as if measure could tame pain. When the contraction ebbed, Mary Beth dabbed Lucia's forehead with cool water that still smelled faintly of the ice block it had been an hour ago. Outside, a truck's brakes sighed. Somebody laughed on the far side of the compound where the boys with a baseball had not noticed that history was choosing a minute. The searchlight's pale, slow finger traced the windows and moved on. The autoclave's gauge ticked, staying true in the band of safety Harrigan trusted. He recited quietly what he would do if the baby presented wrong, if the heartbeat dipped, if the power cut and the lamp sputtered, if, checklists stacked like sandbags against the flood. He looked at Mary Beth, and the nurse already had the next tray ready, the next towel folded. They had done this before. They would do it again. That was the point. Another contraction took Lucia, a hard upward climb. She pressed her head back and thought of Genoa, of the smell of wet rope and diesel in the harbour, of the way the men on the piers spoke with their hands because words were rationed too. She heard the clerk's stamp, a heavy clout, and thought absurdly of judges. The stamp belonged to no tribunal she feared. It belonged to a country that wrote things down even when it could have left them blank. In the tower, Alvarez lifted his binoculars and found his own reflection in the hospital glass for a second, a ghost above a lit room. He lowered the glasses and looked out to the mesquite. The wind changed and brought the clean bite of phenol. He thought, without poetry, that medicine had its own front line and that he, who had never fired in anger, was covering a sector few would ever know. The contraction eased, the autoclave sighed, the searchlight kept its patient orbit. Inside the room, Mary Beth's hand did not leave Lucia's. Harrigan touched the gauge once more, eyes flicking to the door as if he could keep interruptions from existing by anticipating them. Somewhere, miles north, an Italian man placed a last brick in a small chapel. Here, a woman squeezed a nurse's hand and breathed to a count. The ground between them vibrated with trains that would not be late. The first thin cry, when it came, would cut the night in two. The clerk rolled the carriage back and fed another sheet of carbon into the Remington so the letters would sink through to a second copy. He did not look up when the door opened. He was trained to keep his eye on the line of type. The stamp waited beside his hand like a small iron verdict. Lucia watched the machine as if it might pronounce a sentence, listened to the tiny high click of the type bars and the ink ribbon's fabric whisper. Mary Beth murmured to her in English and then in careful Italian, repeating the phrases that mattered. "You will have a birth certificate. The doctor will explain everything. We will ask before we touch." The words were bridges laid piece by piece. Harrigan pulled a stool and set it beside the bed so he could talk to both Belandis without craning. He described what would happen when labour turned the corner toward pushing, the way the mask would smell if they used ether, how much pressure forceps allowed him to apply, what signs would tell him the baby was under stress. He did not raise his voice, because no one in the room needed rescue from panic. They needed a pace they could keep. He checked the Pinard horn again, placed just so, watch hand lifting, pulse taken without a stethoscope, like an old trick you never forget, because it never fails. A truck coughed in the yard. The quartermaster corporal came in with a clipboard to have the linen receipt initialed. Alvarez escorted, eyes on hands and doors, noting times. The corporal asked, "Ma'am, where do you want these?" And Mary Beth pointed with her chin without letting go of Lucia's wrist. The corridor did not clog. The forms did not confuse. The paper moved because the war had taught the Americans that paper, if you respected it, moved men and materiel more surely than rumour ever could. On another table, a Red Cross parcel lay open, milk powder, a tin of cocoa, a bar of soap that could make the whole room smell briefly like a different country. Lucia asked about Segoville, and Mary Beth told her the truth. Women and married couples there, yes, transfers south when a family needed space or when a child was expected. The hospital here better fitted for births because planning, like mercy, could be scaled if someone bothered. The nurse's hands were clever and unhurried. "Signora," she said, "the doctor will tell you before he uses anything." "If he uses these," a glance toward the gleaming forceps, "I will be holding you." The lieutenant works like a man fixing a watch. He will not hurry a gear. In the tower, Alvarez wrote generator hours, and then, because he couldn't help it, sketched a tiny baseball in the margin where the boy's diamond sat. He had a feel for rhythms. The hospital's pulse was different from the fences, but they interlocked like gears. He watched the lamp filaments glow without a flicker and marked an X for steady. He looked at the sky and imagined the trains beyond it, Liberty ships beyond the trains, and factories at the end of that chain pouring out everything, bolts and blankets, engines and ether, rifles and oranges. He was not given to speeches. He believed that if you brought the right thing at the right time, people stopped dying. Harrigan called for sips of water between contractions, then held up 3 fingers before he spoke so Lucia could prepare to listen. He explained how he would test for a shoulder that didn't want to turn, and how he would make more room if bone and muscle argued with him. He did not promise miracles. He promised attention, which was better. He put the forceps back and covered them as if they were sleeping birds that would wake only if called. The clerk, work done for the moment, came to the doorway and asked, awkward, careful, if he should ready the certificate form. Harrigan nodded once. The clerk returned to his desk and set up the blanks, left space for the hour, wrote the mother's name in penciled light so he wouldn't misspell it when the time came to ink. He could fill in sheriff and researcher later if someone asked, but the lines that mattered, the place, the date, would be bold and unambiguous. He smudged the pencil and wiped it away with the side of his hand like a draftsman. Lucia whispered something that did not need translating. Mary Beth answered. Harrigan pretended not to hear and gave her dignity by discussing the autoclave cycle instead. He rose, checked the gauge again, and looked at the lamp, then at the door, a loop he had learned in field hospitals and carried to this place where the uniforms were clean and the floors were not dusty, and the danger hid in the body instead of the sky. The contraction came fast and Lucia's breath went ragged, then steadied to the count they had practiced. Alvarez heard the ambulance bell, only one clear note, more courtesy than alarm. He logged the arrival and the minute, and the fact that it stopped, idled, and shut down. No incident, no anomaly. He watched 2 orderlies unload a crate of glass bottles, saw the way they kept their thumbs tucked to avoid a shatter, saw the way the door was held on the hinge so the latch would not slam. Every small act of care kept the great machines running. In another hour, he would drink warm coffee in the tower and imagine a ranch road in daylight. For now, he kept his eyes on the square of brightness where mercy was being manufactured at scale. The clerk set the stamp beside the form and lined the edges, habit-making ceremony from office work. When the moment came, he would press the seal into the paper and the paper would hold. Lucia leaned her head against Mary Beth's shoulder, made a sound that was not quite a sob, and laughed when the nurse told her she was strong. Harrigan stood where he could see the clock and both of their faces. The autoclave exhaled, and the whole room seemed to breathe with it. The wind in the panhandle found every seam in a man's coat and every imperfection in mortar. Sergente Carlo Rinaldi had learned to lay brick from a Sicilian mason who used a string and a plumb bob and a quiet disdain for wasted motion. Here, inside the American wire at Camp Hereford, the chapel wall rose 1 course at a time, and when the bell, no bell, when the guard's voice said enough for the day, Carlo pressed the last brick into a bed he had scored with care. He looked at the line and felt something he did not name. He wiped his trowel. He heard laughter from the baseball field and the low, unimaginable comfort of a library door closing. He had heard about Crystal City. They all had. A family camp, they said, with a hospital, with a pool that had come from irrigation, with women who were not soldiers but were made to live inside a fence anyway. Rumour said babies were being born there and that those babies were being called Americans on paper that couldn't be argued with. He didn't know whether to be angry or relieved. He had expected barbed wire to come with cruelty, because that is how his side had done it when the boot was on their foot. The contradiction made him feel like he was holding a cup that had been filled with oil and water, and both would spill whether he moved or not. A guard read from a newspaper to the men who wanted to stand close enough to hear English as numbers. The numbers were like shell bursts. Liberty ships, 2,710, hammered out from 1941 to now, yard after yard, steel after steel. Sometimes more than one slid into the water on the same day across the nation. Aircraft, 96,000 in the year of our Lord 1944 alone, if the schedule held, which it always did because their schedules were not prayers. They were plans. Tanks, nearly 50,000 Shermans, the guard said, and Carlo tried not to picture that many machines turning the ground under their tracks until seed would not dare to root. The guard said a name, Willow Run, a single plant in Michigan that was turning out B-24 Liberators so fast that at peak a bomber left the line about every 60-odd minutes. Carlo looked at his hands, brick dust turning the skin redder than it was. One plane an hour from one plant, and he was building a chapel to hold the good things he was trying not to think about. The guard turned the page and said that Italian prisoners in the United States counted around 51,000 and that after the armistice, more than 45,000 had volunteered for Italian service units to carry the Americans' crates and repair their roads and stack their feed. Carlo wondered whether there was a word for losing a war so completely that you were grateful to help the victor win it faster. He had been a sergeant in Tunisia. He had seen trucks without fuel, guns without shells, officers without answers. He had seen rum become prayer and prayer become silence. He had seen boys die for want of a fan belt. Now he watched a baseball arc in the dry light of evening over a diamond that had no right to be inside a prison. A bat cracked with that little springy sound that means ash gave way just so. Somewhere, he had learned, an American nurse would slice an orange for an Italian mother so the room would smell like citizenship. He tried to be angry and found he was tired instead. In the barracks, a man argued that numbers were propaganda. Another said numbers didn't care whether you believed them. Carlo folded the newspaper into a rectangle small enough to fit in a breast pocket, as if he could hide what it said close to his heart and keep the damage from spreading. He thought of ships sliding into water one after another like suns in a procession. He thought of machines flaring into sky the way the first swallows come home. He thought, most dangerously, that this kind of order might be the only antidote to chaos men like him had served. He wrote a letter he would not send. He wrote to his mother that Americans had a way of making mercy look like habit, and that habit seemed to be the true secret. He wrote that the chapel would stand because the bricks did not argue with the string. He wrote that the wind made a hymn of everything if you listened long enough. He did not write the part where he began to think he might ask for a visa when the gates opened, or the part where he imagined carrying a crate stamped USA and feeling pride instead of humiliation because the crate would arrive when it was supposed to. Lights came on along the fence. The tower guns were shadows against a lavender sky. Carlo walked past the yard and nodded to a guard who said, "Evening, Sergeant," like they were two men on a street where they would both sleep well. In the distance, a train's horn reached across the map. Somewhere south, a woman breathed to a count. Carlo felt the brick dust on his fingers and thought about how a country that could push out one heavy bomber an hour from a single plant could also pause long enough to type a foreign name correctly on a birth certificate. He looked back at the chapel and decided to lay the next course straighter still. Harrigan had learned to keep his voice even over the rattle of field cots and the complaints of generators. The Crystal City ward required a different kind of steadiness, the unhurried tone that settled a room like sand in a jar. He laid the forceps on the tray with a care that would have made a watchmaker nod. The metal shone like an oath. Mary Beth checked the ether bottle by holding it to the light and rotating it slowly, a sailor's trick to see impurities swirl. The room ticked with ordinary sounds. Pen against chart, instrument against pan, the soft thud of a shoe heel when a contraction tightened muscles against shoe leather. Lucia watched them organize their tools and their faces. She had met men who made order into cruelty. These people made order into a ramp she could climb. The lieutenant had a way of narrating without condescension. "You will feel pressure. I am checking position. We will breathe together." As if he were calling cadence that required no translation. Mary Beth touched the inside of Lucia's wrist and rested there, counting with her fingertips and with a watch she wore pinned upside down at the neck so she could glance down and read time without moving her hand. Alvarez brought the quartermaster corporal up the corridor with a case of glass bottles cushioned in shredded paper. Labels faced forward, caps crimped smooth. He signed for them, wrote down the mileage on the truck, dismissed it with a nod, and lingered in the doorway long enough to see that the swing of the door did not bump the instrument tray. He had to fight a smile. He knew how ridiculous it sounded, guarding a boundary of air from an errant hinge. But he had learned that the hinge, the bulb, the gasket, those small pieces were the difference between a problem solved in the moment and a disaster retold for years. The fetal heart tones came to Harrigan as a regular drum under water. He angled the Pinard horn a few degrees, eyes at a slant toward his watch, and marked the rhythm with pencil. He adjusted Lucia by inches. He asked Mary Beth for towels. He thought of all the places in the world where towels would have been a gamble, and felt, as he always did, the luxury of knowing he would not run out. He could not say so aloud. Luxury sounded wrong inside a fence. But he let the feeling become resolve. He remembered field stations where ether bottles were counted like ammunition and where sterile procedure was a polite suggestion men made to each other while swatting flies. Here the autoclave's steam gauge held steady, the sterile packs were cool to the touch through their wrappers, and the lamp lit the tray without a single tremor. He knew the generator hours, the replacement bulbs, the spare gaskets on a shelf. He had asked for duplicates of everything and had been given them. He did not flaunt this. He simply made a habit of certainty. Lucia's breath hit a snag. Mary Beth found it for her again, pull and release, the tide made of numbers. Harrigan had his hand on the child's turning and knew it would be a negotiation and not a fight. He said as much, choosing the word with care because words were instruments too. He remembered a line from training about calm being contagious, and he tried to show the baby the way with his own shoulders. Outside, the guard's footsteps tracked a perimeter like a second hand. Alvarez went back to his tower and took a swallow of coffee that had gone warm. He logged the delivery and the return. He flipped a page and noted fuel on hand, calculated hours to refuel, circled a number that meant a gasket should be replaced before it failed. He did not think of himself as a strategist. He thought about how, if you replaced the gasket on schedule, the lamp didn't fail, the doctor didn't improvise in the dark, and a woman did not make a sound that you wished you could forget. He watched a bat stitch the night with erratic thread and waited for the quiet to continue. Harrigan murmured to Mary Beth. They moved together the way engineers do when they have built a bridge and are watching the first truck roll over. He set the forceps aside. He would not need them if the turning held. He kept his hand, his voice, his breath as metronome. He remembered with no shame the chapter and verse of the Geneva Convention that demanded humane treatment of prisoners of war, and he applied it here as if the words had included women and unborn children by implication. He had learned long ago that the law was not a ceiling, it was a floor on which you could build. Lucia began to cry, and did not know whether it was fear or relief. Mary Beth smiled the small smile that looks, from a distance, like discipline. She said the kind of things a nurse says when her hands are busy, the ordinary music of competence. The room held them all in the same light. The autoclave exhaled a satisfied sigh and quieted, a machine that had done its work and might do it again at a moment's notice. Harrigan's palm warmed, and he felt the shift that mattered. Beyond the wire, a freight horn leaned into the night. In Hereford, a man not yet asleep stared at the line of bricks he had laid and imagined a church service that would not be held until after the war. In the ward, the lieutenant squared his shoulders, Mary Beth steadied Lucia's chin, and the next contraction rose. not like a wave now, but like a door being pushed open from the other side. The chapel's cross at Hereford was a plain thing, 2 timbers salvaged from a crate that had once held something the Americans had ordered in bulk. Carlo stood below it in the late light and drew a breath he could almost call clean. The wind pressed his shirt against his ribs and tried to make a banner of him. He had learned to read the camp by its sounds, the scrape of boots, the lonely clank of a mess hall lid, the unmistakable joy of a baseball hit square. The diamond held 6 men and a boy's worth of laughter, and for a moment he could believe they had all met here on purpose. He walked toward the library because it was impossible, and therefore a comfort. Inside a prison, shelves of books in 3 languages, spines with gold letters rubbed a little by hands. He ran a finger along a title and felt the powder of old leather. A guard leaned on the jamb and read from a newspaper in a voice that tried to be neutral. The paper gave numbers the way an artillery plot gives angles. Liberty ships, 2,710. Aircraft this year on course to pass 90,000. Tanks. Sherman's enough that the name had stopped meaning a man and started meaning a shape your dream could not walk around. The guard flipped the page and read a small piece about Italian service units, about men like Carlo who would carry, repair, stack, dig and drive under American orders to make the mountain of goods climb itself. The paragraph mentioned that volunteers numbered in the tens of thousands. No adjective, no drumbeat, just a number laid like a tool on a bench. Carlo listened because there was nothing else to do and because the numbers were the only honest language left. He went outside and saw the baseball arc again, a curve that found a glove with a pop. The fence threw a shadow on the outfield that looked like a pattern someone had planned. He looked down at his hands and saw mortar stains he had not washed off. He thought about the rumour from Crystal City that an Italian woman had been given an orange slice in labour, so the room would smell like a place where people ate fruit for pleasure. He thought about a birth certificate with a county name that would sit on a table like a passport even when there was no ship. In the ward at Crystal City, Lucia tasted the edge of an orange segment and blinked as if the sweetness stung. Mary Beth had cut it with a knife she kept sharpened on a small stone because dull tools are disrespectful. Harrigan said something about timing, and Lucia heard the word as if it were a bell tone from a church back home. The nurse wiped her mouth. The contraction rose. The nurse's hand returned to its station without looking. It was a dance not taught to music. Alvarez checked the time and the fuel and thought about Willow Run because the guard at Hereford had a cousin in Detroit who had written a letter, then another, about a plant that was a city that was a theory of how you make a war end sooner. A bomber every hour at peak, the cousin had written, and if that was bragging, it had been earned with shift work and grit. Alvarez traced the number on his ledger margin before rubbing it out, as if the act of making the mark and erasing it would disguise the superstition he felt about not naming victory too aloud. In his bunk, Carlo unfolded the paper he had folded into a precise packet. He read the paragraph about ships again and tried to picture them not as steel, but as days, each launched day a ship, an argument in metal that the future would not be left to chance. He read about aircraft and realised that the sky over Europe could be made to darken by schedule. He read about tanks and tasted dust. He wished to be wrong and found he was not. The numbers fit each other. They made a lattice that would not collapse if you removed any one beam. Back at Crystal City, the ward smelled briefly like a grove. Mary Beth smiled because she knew what a smell could do. Harrigan's hands were steady because he had repeated this movement in his head more times than he could count. The lamp held steady because a man in a tower had circled a gasket on a maintenance list the day before. Lucia breathed what Mary Beth told her to breathe. There is a way people who have given up on miracles still let themselves believe in gears. Carlo returned to the chapel. He laid a hand flat against the brick and felt the day's heat escaping into his palm. He whispered a half-prayer he could not finish and looked up at the cross made from a crate that had once held something, tools, rations, parts. He thought of crates moving by the hundreds of thousands, by the millions, all of them going to exactly where they should go, and of a country that, by some alchemy of habit and hope, had decided that a woman in labour and a man with a ledger were both parts of the same victory. The lamp pooled light like a promise across the sheeted table, and Harrigan moved into that circle the way a man steps into a doorway with his hat off. Lucia's face shone with sweat that had dried and been replaced and dried again, the salt leaving a faint map. Mary Beth's fingers found the places that eased fear and pressure both. The lieutenant spoke in low tones, not to hypnotize, but to let the mind find something steady to braid to the breath. He felt the child's head and the angle of the shoulder, and knew that forceps would be needed if the body did not turn at the next surge. He thought about leverage and tissue and the window between help and harm, and he let himself trust the tools that had been made in their thousands and sent to places like this because someone in a plant had done their job. Alvarez took a last swallow of coffee and eyed the generator readout. Hours to refuel, gaskets in spec, spares on the shelf. He had never been to Michigan, but he knew the name Willow Run the way you know the names of saints, through other men's stories of intervention. A bomber every 60-odd minutes at peak, they said, one plant outproducing the air fleets his side had heard about in schoolbooks. He did not say it aloud. He just let the number sit under his tongue like a prayer bead. Harrigan set the forceps on the sheet and spoke Lucia through the moment when pressure becomes trust. He felt the instrument's weight, knew its steel the way a gunner knows a good barrel's tone. The force he applied was not muscle, but experience measured in ounces and in restraint. Mary Beth anchored Lucia's shoulders and told her exactly when to push and when to hold, counting in Italian under her breath, numbers transformed into medicine. The room held its breath with them. The autoclave was quiet, its work done. The lamp hummed softly, a note that said the grid was holding. Lucia gave a sound that was more anger than fear, and then, in the stillness after, a softer sound that was relief learning a new language. Harrigan moved with the calm of a man threading a needle in a moving vehicle, and then felt the turn he had been waiting for. The child crowned. Time thinned. He said one word. Mary Beth smiled that same small smile and put her hands where hands go when you are the second to hold the world. In Hereford, Carlo lay awake and counted what he could not see. Ships sliding down ways at a rate that would have sounded like braggadocio if you did not know yards could be multiplied. Aircraft rising from lines that ran like rivers. Tanks that were not legends but appliances. He did not know the name of the bomber plant, but if someone had told him one factory could roll a heavy airplane into the sun roughly every hour, he would have laughed last year. Tonight, he stared at the ceiling and accepted it like a weather report. Harrigan lifted and guided with a tenderness that would have surprised the men who had known him under shell fire. The baby slid free and announced itself with a cry that made Alvarez, 2 fences and a corridor away, look up into the night as if the stars had said his name. Mary Beth wrapped the child in a warmed towel and did the things you do when the clock starts for a life. Clear the airway, rub the back, note colour and tone with a practised eye. It was not the modern score that would be invented years hence. It was the older, simpler grammar of breath and pink and grip. Harrigan cut and tied with hands that did not shake. The clerk stepped into the doorway, hat in his hands like a parishioner. "Do we, sir?" he asked, and Harrigan nodded once. The clerk went back to his desk and typed the hour and the county and the city and the words that mattered more than the clerk could have guessed when he took the job. Place of birth, Crystal City. He pressed the seal so firmly that the paper took the impression like a hill takes a footprint. The stamp's handle was warm in his palm. Alvarez marked the minute in his ledger and then, because no one was watching, drew a tiny star beside it. The tower light swung and returned. Beyond the wire, a freight horn made its long syllable, and then its shorter ones, a pattern you felt in your sternum. He let the sound and the cry from the ward braid together in his head until they were one note. Mary Beth laid the child against Lucia's chest. skin against skin. The nurse's hand stayed a moment longer than it had to. Harrigan stepped back and let the room come down from its height. He washed his hands and watched the water pink for a heartbeat and then run clear. He arranged the forceps back on their tray by habit and gratitude both. In Hereford, Carlo exhaled long and slow and did not know why. He would learn in a letter months from now that on this night a woman from his country had given birth under the care of people who had sworn to fight him and who had done their duty at a bedside without violating their vow. He would not be surprised. The numbers had already told him how the story went. They had said that when a nation can build a heavy bomber about every hour from a single plant, it can also afford to keep a lamp from flickering while an enemy's child learns first breath. Morning came to Crystal City as a pale square of light on linen, the autoclave clicking down from its cycle like a metronome ending a song. Mary Beth found the squeak in the bassinet wheel, touched it with a drop of mineral oil, and the room settled into that military quiet veterans recognise, everything moving, nothing clattering. Lucia drifted, hand resting on the baby's back, astonished that breath could be so small and yet command a whole ward. Word moved through the camp like small weather across open ground. In the mess line, someone said the Belandi baby had come without incident. Mother stable, red-haired nurse smiling. A German woman crossing the yard wiped her hands on her apron and faced the hospital to murmur a fast little prayer. An Italian grandmother nodded toward the fence line and whispered grazie, as if gratitude had a direction. Even the guards walked a fraction lighter on the catwalks. Alvarez briefed his relief by the book and kept the private magic to himself. No alarms beyond a loose chain, generator within hours limit, one ambulance in and out, one delivery accomplished, no ammunition expended. He climbed down, off duty, then made a slow lap anyway, listening for a hinge that wanted grease, palming a searchlight's motor housing to feel for hot bearings, pressing his thumb into creosote to judge whether the sun had cooked fence posts thin. The best problems were the ones nobody met. Harrigan met the camp physician and laid out margin like a battle plan. Duplicate every critical item in the theatre, move one spare autoclave gasket from storeroom to ready per unit in service, add a bulb to the lamp drawer and another to the drawer marked another. The physician, parsimonious by habit, signed because results had argued louder than thrift. Harrigan did not call it victory. He called it insurance. Field stations had taught him the quietest weapon is redundancy. Mary Beth walked the ward like a squad leader re-inspecting a bivouac. She tucked corners, re-rolled bandage, touched each glass bottle on the shelf with the back of her forefinger, counting by feel so the number lived in muscle memory. Then she sliced oranges. The bright smell turned the room into a kitchen for a heartbeat. Kitchens are where people remember they are alive. Lucia woke to citrus and smiled the cautious smile of someone who had expected punishment and found procedure instead. By midday, the ward ran so smoothly, the moving parts were hard to see. A Trieste midwife among the internees asked formally whether she might observe future deliveries. Mary Beth routed the request properly. The physician consented. Instruction under supervision would have been normal in any civilian hospital, and normal had become an objective inside this wire. Harrigan liked the idea for a reason he didn't say aloud. Competence multiplies fastest when it is taught, catalogued, and scheduled. A quartermaster truck rattled in with crates stenciled USA. A private with a clipboard turned stencils into comforts, milk bottles, bandages, soap, another case of oranges. The same rail that hauled ammunition here hauled fruit too. The same nation that counted bombers by the hour counted baby blankets by the dozen. Alvarez penciled a request for one more tower bulb and, almost sheepish, one more for the spare box. Better to be the man who asked for two than the man who needed one. Lucia dreamed of a narrow Genoa street suddenly bright with paper instead of ash, pages landing in her hands with Zavala County typed in perfect rows. Waking, she asked whether documents truly meant what people promised. "They do here," Mary Beth said, smoothing the sheet. Outside, towers made their slow revolutions. Above them, contrails stitched the high blue like proof 2,000 miles long that schedules could conquer weather. Somewhere a freight horn said the continent itself was on time. Afternoon shadows stretched. Alvarez signed his relief's logbook and before stepping off the ladder lowered the ward's shade by an inch to spare a sleeping child the glare. No clerk would record the gesture. It would never appear in a briefing. Yet he felt, as he always did after a shift that ended without incident, that a wall had held because ordinary hands had done unremarkable things precisely when they should. The autoclave began another cycle. The hospital ticked toward the next need. He paused at the pool the internees used, a former irrigation pond of improbable blue, and counted heads. A boy cannonballed, surfaced laughing, then looked toward the tower with the instinct of a child who understands rules but also trusts them. Alvarez nodded back. It would have been easy to sneer at a pool inside a fence. He had learned better. People who slept, ate, worked, and sometimes swam kept ledgers cleaner and nights quieter. Mercy, scaled and scheduled, defended its own perimeter. Harrigan returned to check the baby's colour and the mother's pulse. On the chart he wrote the same neat hand he used for orders, then added a second checkmark beside "spare gasket, ready." He looked at Mary Beth and saw a professional contentment he recognised from the line, the sense that a team had built a bridge and sent weight across it, then stood under the span to listen for rumours of strain. The ward made that soft, purposeful noise veterans carry home. At day's end, the newborn hiccuped like a ticking clock. Lucia laughed, really laughed, and covered the tiny mouth with a finger as if to keep time from spilling out. The nurse dimmed the lamp. A guard on the catwalk tightened a chain link that wanted to sing. A freight train slid somewhere beyond the mesquite. The baby slept. Protocol did what courage alone never could. It made safety repeatable. Tomorrow would need the same checklists. Everyone present seemed determined to bring them. Evening took the heat out of the catwalk but left the creosote smell in the fence posts thick as a memory. Alvarez clipped a lamp to the guardrail and spread his ledger on a crate, tallying a .30 caliber belt link by link. The numbers mattered because he had learned what happened when they didn't. A missing box of blanks in peacetime becomes a missing crate of ball when lightning takes the radio and something ugly moves in the dark. He worked forward through the watch, searchlight hours, generator tone, truck mileage. Preventive maintenance checks and services, PMCS, was a mouthful that meant fewer funerals. He wrote OK with a blocky hand beside bearings he had felt cool and belts he had watched ride true. From the ward drifted the soft field noise veterans never forget. Cartwheels, paper quietly torn from tape, a nurse's shoe heel thudding the floor with a rhythm that sounded like duty at rest. He didn't need to see it to guard it. At 2000, a GMC CCKW rolled by with a new pallet of linen. The driver signed for the handoff. Alvarez signed for the receipt. 2 signatures against chaos. He watched carefully as the door swung and did not strike the instrument table. He watched the corporal stack the empty crates square so no one would trip in a hurry later. He knew the sermon. When battle comes, chance is loud. In peace, chance whispers. He preferred to drown it in paperwork. A chain at gate 2 had rattled the night before. Tonight, he stood there and listened. No rattle. He had crimped a new link himself and filed the paperwork after. The replacement wasn't heroic. It was, like most of the war, correct. If the chain sang again, he would silence it. If the lamp flickered, he would swap a bulb. If the generator stumbled, he would pull it down before it fell. Towers fail in stories. Towers last in ledgers. Halfway through the shift, a wind arrived from nowhere and pushed dust across the yard in a thin sheet. He turned the searchlight, lowered the beam to keep it out of the ward, and watched it silver the haze into a river. On clear nights, he could see contrails dragging straight lines over Texas, each one an argument in white that schedules could beat weather. One plant, he had been told, could roll a heavy bomber into sunlight roughly every hour at peak. That wasn't a rumour anymore. It was a habit. For a moment he let his mind travel that assembly line. Jigs and fixtures, rivet guns coughing in chorus, men and women in denim moving like a drilled platoon. Those airplanes were the far end of his ledger. If he kept a bulb from failing, someone kept a jig from slipping, someone else counted fuel, and a navigator marked a target because the clock and the sky agreed. He had learned to believe in the chain, not the slogans about it. In the ward, Mary Beth checked the baby's colour and touched Lucia's wrist the way she always did, with fingers that made confidence feel like temperature. Harrigan was somewhere in the back office tallying supplies against shipments and writing the word margin in a notebook because he couldn't help it. Their routines gave Alvarez permission to keep his own. He wrote a small star beside the hour the child had been born, then frowned and erased it. Superstition lived where discipline was thin. The radio squawked once with a false tongue, then steadied. He logged the anomaly and the silence after as if silence could be measured and filed. On the far side of the yard, a ball game resumed under the compound lights. The crack of ash on horsehide sounded like a promise America kept for itself even when no one asked. He swiveled the beam away so the players wouldn't lose the ball in glare. They yelled thanks and went back to the ordinary grace of catching. Near 2,200 he took apart the tower phone and reseated the wires because the line had felt mushy in his palm. He didn't need an order. He knew from ranch jobs and barracks life that every device is a soldier. It wants clear instructions and wages paid on time. He screwed the plate back in place and tested the handset. The click came back crisp like a salute. He noted the fix in a margin already crowded with tiny victories. Around midnight, the wind quit. The air went still in that heavy way the panhandle sometimes manages, as if the ground were holding its breath. He marked the hour for generator maintenance tomorrow and added a note about the fence line on the south side where Mesquite reached for the wire like a thief with patience. He would cut it back at dusk when shadows turned small mistakes into big ones. He would sign for the clippers. He would return them clean. At 100, a nurse laughed, low and tired and joyful in the way only nurses know. Alvarez closed the ledger and rested a hand on the cover. The book wasn't pretty. It smelled of oil and pencil and sun. But it had, he believed, saved more lives than any speech, because each line taught the next line what to do. He looked toward the ward and felt the strange pride of a man whose post was a long way from glory, yet exactly where victory lives. Night pressed the barracks roof flat and low at Hereford, and Carlo lay awake counting what he could not see. He tried sheep, then ships. Ships answered. He saw hulls sliding down ways at a rate no priest would bless. One today, another tomorrow, two on Saturday when the tides and cranes agreed. The Guard's newspaper had written it plain, 2,710 Liberty ships by war's end. The number didn't argue. It just sat there like the horizon, a fact for navigating. He turned the page in his mind and found airplanes. 96,000 scheduled for 1944 if the lines held pace, and everyone in camp knew the lines held pace. There was a plant they spoke of with a mixture of awe and irritation, Willow Run, that could roll a B-24 into sunlight about every 60 minutes at peak. One factory, 1 hour, one four-engined machine, again and again. Carlo felt the floor tilt as if a wave had lifted the world and left it different when it set it down. Tanks came next. Shermans in numbers that made the name stop meaning a man and start meaning a shape your boots avoided in dreams. Tens of thousands, nearly 49,000 by the time the accountants closed their books. He had once believed strategy mattered more than scale. Tonight he understood that strategy without scale is a sermon nobody hears. If the United States could replace a burned tank in the time it took a letter to cross the ocean, then the ocean had changed sides. He tried to resist the arithmetic. Pride is a stubborn clerk. But the figures refused to be partisan. They stacked into a lattice a bricklayer could respect. Around him the barracks breathed and turned and muttered. A man snored like a saw cutting green wood. Someone whispered a prayer that didn't ask for victory, only for an end that left his family unpunished. Carlo pictured the chapel wall he had raised and understood it as a kind of surrender, a place to bring whatever came. Rumour from Crystal City said a woman from Genoa, someone's cousin, someone's niece, had been given an orange slice in labour so the room would smell like a country at peace. The same rumour insisted the child's Texas birth certificate was already typed, seal pressed so hard the paper kept the shape of the metal. He wanted to call it propaganda, yet he had watched guards treat him with courtesy that wasn't weakness, had read library books no one hid, had heard a baseball game in the yard like a civic chorus. On his bunk he unfolded the day's paper he had carried to meals and to chapel, then folded again. He read that roughly 51,000 Italian prisoners were held in the United States, and that after the armistice around 45,000 had volunteered for Italian service units. He had mocked those men in letters he didn't send. Now he saw their choice as a kind of clarity. If a machine is dragging the world toward an end, you put your shoulder where it saves fingers, not where it breaks them. He considered what one of the old sergeants used to say when a ration truck finally arrived. Scale is mercy when it belongs to your side. The Germans had talented engineers. The Italians had fierce regiments on the right day. The Americans had factories that did not sleep. If one plant could outproduce the yearly totals of small nations, then the argument had shifted from tactics to throughput. If bombers left an assembly line each hour, then ours themselves had become American. He thought of his mother, of the courtyard with the fig tree that never quite bore enough fruit, of the day he had sworn he would come home in a uniform richer than the one he left in. He imagined writing her now, telling her that the country he fought had built for itself the habit of plenty and, for reasons he didn't fully grasp, had decided to let enemies taste it inside a fence. He pictured the orange segment, the lamp that did not flicker, the nurse who counted in Italian because numbers are bilingual. Sometime before dawn he slept and dreamed of brick courses laid straighter than the last, of mortar mixed to the right colour, of a wall that did not fall when men leaned on it. He woke not to a bugle, but to the smell of coffee and hot iron from the stoveplate, and the first thought that came to him did not feel like treason so much as relief, that the war, given these numbers, might truly end, and that ending could be survived. He rubbed mortar dust from his palms, though none was there. Far south, the hospital light dimmed to spare a newborn's eyes. East of both fences, the sun lifted without asking leave. Carlo folded the paper back into its hard little rectangle and slid it over his heart as if weight could make belief real. Outside, the guard called, "Morning, Sergeant," and he answered in the same tone, two men under the same sky, one of them newly convinced that victory, like mercy, was an industrial process. He put on his cap and went to the chapel to lay another brick. Harrigan chalked a board in the back office the way a gunnery officer might plot a shoot. Births, complications, supplies on hand, generator hours, lamp bulbs, gaskets. Beside the tidy columns he pinned a newspaper clipping about ship output because he liked the juxtaposition. The same machines that pressed valves for autoclaves made fittings for Liberty ships. The same rails that hauled ammunition into ports hauled oranges into Texas. He had stopped apologizing for the poetry of logistics. The camp physician looked in, nodded at the columns, and said nothing. Silence, here, was the compliment professionals paid. Mary Beth arrived with the morning's temperature grid and the soft grin tired nurses wear when they know a ward is winning. She set a stack of used instrument wrappers on the desk and said, "Sterile at 0600, sterile at 1200, sterile at 1800, like a litany." Harrigan wrote margin in the corner, underlining it once, then once more, a superstition disguised as method. He drafted a short memo recommending duplicate packs for every critical instrument set, 2 bulbs in every drawer, and a ready gasket per autoclave unit. None of it looked heroic. All of it defended the moment the lights might flicker. He had learned in field hospitals that good fortune is a lagging indicator of preparation. On the ward, the baby hiccuped. Lucia laughed and immediately looked guilty, then laughed again because joy is disobedient that way. Alvarez stepped through the doorway, hat in hand, because the room felt like a chapel, and reported the prior night's maintenance. Chain repaired, tower phone rewired, searchlight bearings cool, generator check scheduled for dusk. He wanted to say he had lowered the shade to keep glare off a newborn's face. He didn't. Instead, he pointed to a penciled note about the south fence where Mesquite reached for the wire. Harrigan wrote "cut back at dusk" and underlined it. Ink turns intention into duty. He allowed himself a zoom out. The war had taught him the nation's genius wasn't simply invention, it was interchangeability. A watchword from the ordnance men, standardize, had crept into medicine until a woman delivering behind wire could count on drapes that fit, gauze that didn't fray, lamp sockets that matched. He knew surgeons who swore by famous names. He swore by crates arriving on time and spare parts in the right drawer. He believed Geneva's articles were stronger when backed by warehouses. Mary Beth leaned against the door jamb and watched him chalk. "It looks like a baseball score," she said. He grinned. The camp's diamond had been loud the previous night. He'd heard the bat crack even through the generator's hum. America, he thought, was the only country he knew that could stage a ball game inside a prison and make both parts feel ordinary. He wondered how many boxes of balls a single plane hour at Willow Run would buy, then shook his head at himself and wrote another column. Water. He listed gallons used, ward, kitchen, laundry, because a man who knows water knows how fires end and children bathe. He added ICE, because ice turned pain into something cooperatively endured. He added SOAP, because soap was an armistice played out in small truces at the sink. He wrote redundancy and let the chalk squeak. He wasn't trying to teach anyone. He was trying to keep himself honest about what victory looked like at the edge of its map. At lunch, the physician signed the duplicate kit request, no argument. The quartermaster clerk sent up a note that 2 bulbs had already been pulled for the theatre, and another 2 staged. Habit, not favouritism. On a crate, someone had written "handle like prayer" in pencil, and then crossed it out, embarrassed. Harrigan rubbed the mark with his thumb and left it legible. The only superstition he allowed was the superstition of being ready. He walked the ward and paused at the window where contrails crossed like chalk lines barely erased. Men would talk about bomb loads and calibers for decades. He would remember the feel of a warm gasket in the pocket of a fresh apron. "We'll add a second cycle at 1400, Mary Beth said, handing him a schedule. He nodded. Lives were not won by declarations. They were won by calendars that kept their promises and by people who made sure clocks and bodies agreed. In the afternoon, he visited stores and checked the labels. Ether, sulphur, suture, drapes, everything where it belonged. He thought of the line the old colonel had used. Decency is doctrine when you can afford it, and felt the uncomfortable truth that the United States could afford it because factories sang while other nations starved. He did not draw conclusions beyond his post. He kept his pencil sharp, his gaskets staged, his lamp bright. The baby slept and hiccuped on schedule, as if conspiring with him. Dusk came fast, the way Texas dusk does, like a shade pulled. Alvarez and a private cut back the mesquite that had reached for the wire. The branches bled green sap, and the air went sharp and pleasant. Harrigan erased the words "cut back at dusk" with the side of his hand and wrote "done," a small satisfaction he let himself keep. He looked at the board, berths, supplies, water, ice, soap, and felt the strange pride of a man who had not fired a shot and yet had done something undeniably warlike. He had made tomorrow more reliable than yesterday. Years later, post-VE Day, past the last transport into the long tail of 1948, The heat came off the Panhandle fields in familiar waves. The Hereford chapel, brick upon brick, laid by hands that once saluted a different flag, threw a shadow that looked like a ship's profile at anchor. A young woman traced the mortar with her fingertips and read her birthplace aloud, as if reciting a password. Crystal City, Zavala County, Texas. Her mother, Lucia, laughed through tears at the sound of it in her daughter's voice. Crystal City had wound down by then, families dispersing along so many tracks that maps couldn't hold the lines. The rumour mill gave way to forwarding addresses and long letters whose stamps fought heat and time. The hospital's logbook closed with a last neat entry, and the autoclave cooled to silence. The pool went back to being an irrigation pond. A clerk boxed certificate carbon copies and sent them to county storage, where dust did its diligent work. The towers stood a while, then didn't. Carlo, who had once argued that numbers lied, carried crates for an Italian service unit to a stateside depot in rain that made the asphalt steam. He did it with a strange pride that confused men who hadn't lived inside a ledger. "I am moving a promise," he said simply, and no one laughed. After demobilization, he filled out visa forms in ink that didn't blot, answering questions carefully, handwriting so exact it looked like blueprint letters. He stapled a letter from a sponsor to the back. Mary Beth sat a nursing board exam with a pencil she sharpened to a needle tip, wrote with the speed of a telegrapher, and, when asked to list an ethical principle, wrote, "Do on ordinary days what you boast about after extraordinary ones." She packed a small case, rode a bus, and walked into a charity hospital where the lamps did not hum as steadily and the gaskets were not always staged. She set about staging them because habit, good habit, travels like a tune. Alvarez came home to San Antonio, took off the tower harness, and kept the ledger. Not the same book, but the same conviction that the right line, drawn at the right time, saves the right life. He married a woman who called him out when his neatness became tyranny and called him a hero when his neatness became shelter. He coached a team on a dusty diamond behind a church and taught boys to back up throws and change bulbs before they failed. Harrigan wore a tie like a compromise and a stethoscope like a memory. He taught surgical interns to count instruments with the gravity of men reading scripture. He never stopped underlining margin in meeting notes. When asked years later whether Crystal City had changed his mind about anything, he said, "It made me believe in the Geneva Convention the way a carpenter believes in level, and left it there." He kept a gasket in his desk drawer as a talisman and never explained why. The young woman from the chapel, Lucia's daughter, kept her birth certificate in a wallet worn soft as fabric. When customs officers asked, she presented it the way a standard bearer tilts a flag, serious, proud, careful. She visited the old campsite when a museum case finally held a forceps set, a pinard horn, and one of those embossed seals. "That was our weather," she told the docent, and the docent, bless her, wrote the phrase down and made it a label so strangers could understand. Hereford's brick held the Panhandle's sun even as the wind searched for seams. A pastor preached there sometimes about forgiveness in a voice that understood fatigue. Carlo stood in the doorway once, head bare, and let the coolness inside take his breath. He didn't light a candle. He didn't need to. He had carried enough boxes to know the weight of intention. When he stepped back into the heat, he felt lighter than when he entered. If anyone asked about the numbers, they were all still astonishing. 2,710 Liberty ships, around 354,000 aircraft across the war, 49,000 Shermans, 51,000 Italian prisoners taken to the United States, 45,000 volunteering for ISUS after the armistice. In the ledger of a single camp, more than 150 wartime births, over 250 by the time the gates finally shut. Statistics become less cold when you have held one of them. In the evening, the chapel's shadow grew long enough to touch a barbed wire remnant strung as a museum exhibit. The wire caught the light and turned briefly beautiful, a thing that had been only restraint acquiring for a breath the dignity of a memory honestly kept. Lucia's daughter folded her certificate once more and slid it back into her wallet. "It wasn't paradise," she said to no one in particular, "but the lamp didn't flicker." Sometimes a nation's epitaph fits on a single stubborn sentence. They walked back across cut grass that crackled underfoot, and somewhere a train pulled a long note through heat-blurred air. It sounded like departure and arrival at once, the way good endings always do. In the museum, the gasket lay under glass, a ring of rubber remembering steam. In the chapel, the brick kept its alignment. In the city down the road, nurses changed bulbs before they failed. The war had ended, the habits did not. That was the point. In a climate-controlled case behind low glass, a forceps set with jaws that still shine, a pinard horn with the wood darkened where a cheek would rest, a Texas birth certificate stamped so deep the paper keeps the metal's memory. A school group leans close and the docent points at the seal. She says, "Crystal City, Zavala County," and the words ride the air like a train whistle, both homely and grand. You can't smell ether through glass, but visitors swear they can. The story, told straight, sounds like fiction. Women labelled enemy aliens delivered babies under the guard of men with Garans and tower-mounted M1919s. The deliveries were safe because the United States could spare drapes, soap, bulbs, gaskets and trained hands on schedule. The surprise is not that the country possessed compassion. It is that compassion arrived in crates, counted and receipted like ammunition. Decency, standardized, proved as decisive as steel when supported by an ocean of it. We step back and the numbers roll in like a tide that refuses to recede. Liberty ships, 2,710,000, steel proofs that supply would not fail. Aircraft, roughly 354,000 across the war, with a single plant once rolling a heavy bomber into daylight about every hour at peak, one factory outproducing the annual ambitions of entire nations. Tanks, the M4 Sherman built in nearly 49,000 copies, parts interchangeable enough that broken strength became repaired strength in a single night. Impossible, only until it happened. But the thesis isn't just quantity, it is what quantity permitted. Because rails hauled more than shells, an orange could be sliced in a ward so a frightened mother smelled a kitchen. Because factories pressed more than gun parts, a lamp did not flicker at the wrong minute. Because generators were inspected and gaskets staged, a birth certificate could be typed without a nurse having to improvise by candle. The Geneva Convention, backed by warehouses, became more than a pamphlet. It became a habit. Carlo's chapel still stands, brick steady against panhandle wind, because men allowed to do ordinary work inside a fence saved themselves from becoming only prisoners. Alvarez's ledger, brittle and oil-smelling now, sits in an archive box. Readers smile at the little star beside a tiny hour because even hard-headed sergeants yield to joy. Mary Beth's handwriting survives in chart columns so straight you could set a level by them. Harrigan's note, margin, underlined twice, shows up on a memo that seems boring until you understand it is victory written small. We can be precise about context. After Operation Torch, Italian prisoners, around 51,000, were shipped to US camps under the Provost Marshal General. After the armistice, roughly 45,000 volunteered for Italian service units, working American logistics. Separately, Department of Justice family camps like Crystal City and Seagoville held civilian women and children, and between wartime and post-war years, more than 250 births occurred at Crystal City alone. The record is not complete by ethnicity per birth, but the effect is beyond dispute. For modern readers, the shock isn't the wire. It is the lamp that didn't flicker. Our myths say mercy is fragile. The ledger at Crystal City says mercy can be engineered. A checklist is a form of courage when you repeat it in heat that cracks fence posts. An orange slice is logistics converted into grace. A gasket is a promise kept ahead of need. A clerk's stamp, thud seal, turns breath into citizen, and citizen into future, even when the mother's address includes the word camp. The last veterans I interviewed about Texas camps always circled back to abundance, not gloating, recognition. They fed us like we were their own, one Italian told me years later, gentler than his younger self would have allowed. Another pointed at a ball field on an old map and said, "They gave us this, and we behaved." A guard smiled and said the quiet part aloud. My job was to make sure nothing happened. Most nights, "Nothing did history" has too few such sentences. There is a temptation to sentimentalize any hospital. Resist it. Crystal City stood under towers with guns. It kept schedules because men in other places would have died if trains were late. It existed so exchanges could be made, so families could be counted, so a nation could say, even in war, that rules were not decorative. The humane treatment delivered there was not a detour from victory. It was a demonstration that victory had already been decided, because only abundance permits generosity at scale. Walk out of the museum into the Texas heat. The air smells of dust and cut grass, and the sky is as large as the ledger once was careful. In your pocket is a phone that can list the numbers in a breath. Put it away and try to hear the autoclave's sigh, the clerk's stamp, the nurse's count, the newborn's first protest against silence. Imagine a tower light and a shade lowered 1 inch to protect a stranger's child. That is what won, not mercy instead of power, but mercy expressed as power's highest use. Now listen for the long note of a distant freight, the sound American victory made even when no one saluted. It is leaving and arriving at once. The docent clicks the case light off, and the embossed seal glows for a heartbeat longer in your eyes. You could call it after-image. I call it proof. A nation's strength can be measured in a baby's first breath and the machinery that made it safe, born behind the wire, carried beyond it forever.